Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Field Transmissions. My name is Aaron Provencio, and today I'm joined by a very special guest that I'm very excited to have joining us on today's transmission. But before we get to allowing him to introduce himself, because there's no way I could cover all of that on my own, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them into the comment section below. We will be answering questions that we have time for at the end of the discussion. So please, if you have anything to ask Dr. Hearn down there, please feel free to do so. Additionally, if you would like to make a donation during the stream, please feel free to visit galapagos.org to support our work in the Galapagos archipelago. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Alex Hearn.
Hi, how you doing? It's a real pleasure to be able to spend the afternoon with you. A rather strange day, I must say. A lot of us woke up to the news of tanks rolling into Ukraine, reminiscent of 1939. So obviously, I think a lot of people are feeling very perturbed today and very concerned. But we'll try and get through this and recenter our focus on conservation, even though I think a small part of our minds, everyone's minds right now is in Eastern Europe.
Absolutely, absolutely. But yeah, speaking of kind of where to go from here, what is your background, Dr. Hearn? Where do you come from? Kind of how did you get involved in Galapagos marine conservation?
Well, I'm actually half Polish, which again may respond to why I'm particularly concerned about events happening at the moment. And also British. But I grew up in Spain, and I was always very much into birds. I wanted to become an ornithologist. And then when I was about 15, we did a field trip at school to Galicia, to the north of Spain, where the most amazing seafood comes from. And it was a marine biology field trip, and that really did it for me. And I ended up going on to university to study marine biology. I got my PhD in the Orkney Islands in Scotland. And it was a very small community there. And when I finished, I really wanted to stay. I loved island life. I loved the sense of community. And there's not a day goes by that I don't miss it. But it was very difficult for me to find a job in Orkney at that time. But we had projects with other island archipelagos around the world. And so the opportunity came up to go to Galapagos for 6 months as a volunteer. And well, 20 years later, here I am. Never really left.
Well, I mean, there's worse places to get stuck than in Galapagos, and it's certainly not the first time I've heard that from people. People tend to, end up there on a whim and stay there the rest of their lives. So I can definitely understand that. Now, amongst what is truly an incredible resume of marine biology, conservation advocacy work, you are the president of the organization Migmar. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that organization does and why you focus specifically on migratory species in this region of the Eastern Pacific?
Sure. Well, when I first went to Galapagos, my background is in fisheries ecology. So at that time, 20 years ago, the big issues in Galapagos were sea cucumbers, which were being rather rapidly overexploited, and a poorly controlled lobster fishery. And a lot of the work that was being done at the time with a new marine reserve was very much looking at Galapagos inwards. How can we protect endemic species of Galapagos, which we're still working on? How can we protect the islands from invasive species? How can we improve livelihoods of a rapidly growing community? How can we protect our endemic and benthic resources? But as time went on, I became involved with trying to put the brakes really on this push towards allowing long lining inside the marine reserve. Long lining is a particularly harmful form of fishing. It involves a long line, but with hundreds or even thousands of hooks. And the problem is that it's not very discriminatory in what it catches. And what we found, there were experimental studies in Galapagos, anything between 30 and 70% of the catch was sharks. And I started thinking about, well, what is the role of Galapagos for these species that are highly mobile? and we started a little study. At that time, I was supported by Conservation International, a little study to tag sharks and just see are they resident or not in Galapagos. And what we found almost immediately was that I think we tagged 18 hammerhead sharks at Darwin Island. Within a matter of months, 2 had turned up at Cocos Island on the same day. And of course, Cocos Island is 700 kilometers away. It belongs to Costa Rica. And we were lucky enough that there were researchers there who were asking the same questions that I was asking. So we really, it was almost organic. We started talking, okay, if we're going to do this kind of work, let's do it jointly. Let's address this issue of how do our marine protected areas in the region, that's Malpelo, Coiba, Cocos, Galapagos, really contribute to the protection of highly mobile migratory species. But if we're going to do this, we need to make sure we're all using the same technology, that it's compatible, and we need to be talking. And so we ended up just informally creating this network called Migramar, Marine Migrations in Spanish. And eventually, after about 10 years, we formalized it as an organization. We now have an executive director, 22 members, working all the way from Baja California in Mexican Pacific, all the way down to Chile, and really pushing for measures in the Eastern Tropical Pacific that would allow for the protection of these highly migratory species. And so a lot of the work that we've done was key to getting the expansion of the Revillagigedo Marine Reserve in Mexico not long ago. Last year, Panama increased its marine protection to reach 30% at a stroke, and that's thanks to the work carried out by Hector Guzman over there. Costa Rica has expanded Cocos. We've been tagging animals there and looking at their home ranges there. The Galapagos expansion was just happened now, and the Malpelo expansion, which is currently underway. So it's rather gratifying to see that, you know, a lot of these new marine protected areas, marine expansions, are using the science that we're generating. And that was the point of this Migramar network. So we all belong to our own organizations as well. I'm a professor at the University of San Francisco de Quito, but by having this collaborative network organization that's regional, it allows us that flexibility to really help each other across the entire Eastern Tropical Pacific.
Yeah, and as you mentioned there, as you went through the many different countries and nationalities of organizations that you work with and in partnership for the protection of these highly transient species, I think it really goes to show how much it takes to manage, protect, and conserve species that are moving throughout, you know, entire essentially landscapes, continent scale areas of the ocean. And I'm curious if you could go a little bit more into detail about why is it more complex or more difficult to conserve migratory transient aquatic marine species?
Well, absolutely. Coastal marine reserves or marine reserves that are created to protect, you know, a rocky reef or something that's not highly mobile, you can encompass the home range of the species or the entire habitat with a single management measure, right? With highly mobile species, you need to think about what their key habitats are. So, for example, hammerhead sharks, again, I guess because they're my favorite because they're the ones that got me into this, and they're obviously highly iconic. Hammerhead sharks form these large aggregations around oceanic islands such as Cocos and Darwin and Galapagos, but they pup in coastal lagoons. So they have these at least 2 key habitats that require some level of protection. But then also, well, how do they move between habitat A and habitat B? Do they diffuse across the ocean? In which case, spatial protection measures may be rather difficult. Or do they move along particular corridors? Do they follow particular pathways? So a lot of the work that we're doing is precisely that. Can we identify particular pathways along which these animals move? What we found is that some of them do. And it's for several species of shark and turtle, which is useful because they're both groups of species that are endangered and whose population tendencies are on the decline. And what we found in particular is that these movements between Galapagos and Cocos seem to associate with the Cocos Ridge. The Cocos Ridge is a chain of underwater mountains. In fact, Cocos Island is the only bit of them that sticks out of the surface. And what we think is happening is that they can all these islands and underwater chains of seamounts, they're all volcanic in origin, so they have a strong magnetic signal. And we think that the sharks and turtles can detect the magnetic signal from these seamounts and use all that they're hopping from one seamount to the other, although there's evidence to suggest that they do aggregate around them. But it's more that they're using them as a reference for navigation. And if that's the case, then we can create a protected corridor along that route and protect them as they move. And so the idea, and we've been, the entire Migmar organization has been looking at this for several years now, is it possible to create these swimways, or migravias in Spanish, to protect not just the hotspots, but those routes between the hotspots?
Gotcha. And you said yourself before we went live that you are a birder, or that you're a frustrated ornithologist. And so if people, those at home, are more familiar with what are called flyways, I would imagine it's very similar in the sense that it is paths that transient species utilize year after year on their migration routes, correct?
Yeah, I shouldn't have told you I like birds. You got me there. It was an absolute, we just ripped it off from the bird world. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Well, we certainly won't let them know that you're copying their techniques there. So, expanding on your work with Migmar, as you mentioned, one of the biggest caught international news in terms of both conservation, but just in general, was the recent expansion of the Galapagos Marine Reserve, and it's a very big deal, and for good reason. Can you tell our viewers at home why the Galapagos Marine Reserve, or marine reserve expansions in general, but the GMR's expansion and connection to the Cocos National Park through the Hermandad Marine Reserve is so critical for marine conservation in this part of the Pacific?
Yeah, well, so the Hermandad Marine Reserve is a really interesting case study, because a lot of the time there's this discussion about whether marine reserves are created by top-down measures, which means the government goes in and declares something, or bottom-up grassroots measures. This is an interesting case because the concern about the status of the conservation of the waters around Galapagos really came from all directions at once. So if you remember, in 2017, the authorities in Galapagos detained a Chinese reefer vessel which entered the marine reserve illegally with over 8,000 sharks on board, and I might add, including a whale shark. And automatically, at the moment they crossed the border of the marine reserve, they were breaking the law because they were possessing endangered species on board. Now these were likely fished outside, right? They'd only been in the marine reserve for about 24 hours by the time they actually got detained in court, and all the animals were frozen. But the point is that these animals move in and out. And so it created an immediate outcry in the local community. And a grassroots organization, the Frente Insular, was formed. And the local community was saying, we need to expand the marine reserve. And there were all sorts of calls for this, including all the way out to our national borders, which is 200 nautical miles. So this was happening from a grassroots level. At the same time, the then vice president of Ecuador stated, to the international press that Ecuador would start exploring the feasibility to increase protection around Galapagos. And then about a year and a half later, the then president declared at the climate change COP in Madrid that we needed to also address the emerging climate change threats by evaluating whether Galapagos needed to be expanded or not. At the same time, so we have the concern from the top, the concern from the bottom, but then what about the scientists? Those of us who are out there day in, day out, working with seabirds, with turtles, with sharks, we're concerned. We're concerned because we notice that the animals are moving beyond those boundaries, but also, again, to use the hammerhead as an example, when the current marine reserve was created in 1998, the scalloped hammerhead shark, which is the icon of the marine reserve, was characterized on the IUCN Red List as near threatened. By 2009, it was, I don't know whether you want to call it upgraded or downgraded, depends on your point of view, but it was revised to endangered, and 10 years later, in 2019, to critically endangered. So, I mean, this isn't a species with a certain global distribution, but it's just symptomatic of the fact that this idea that we had at the turn of the century of creating marine reserves around hotspots and then carrying on business as usual outside just wasn't working. And so we looked at a suite of about 30 species of conservation conserve that occur in Galapagos. And just as a really quick, high level, we looked at their conservation status at the turn of the century. Now, over half of them got worse, not better. And so, so now we have from the top, from the bottom, and from the sides, everyone saying, look, there's a problem here. The thing is that we're about to reach our 25th anniversary of the Galapagos Marine Reserve, and the world has changed. Climate change is now a reality. Fishing effort that provoked the creation of the reserve originally has trebled in the region. We're now dealing with fairly depleted resources in terms of endangered species, and an ever more global market for the fishery resources. And so all these things and other threats too, such as ocean plastics, the fact that our fleet are now using fish aggregation devices, they really weren't using them so much in the 90s. These are floating rafts that they seed in the water, and as they drift, they collect fish, and then they've got a radio buoy on them. So, a week, 2 weeks later, they go back, they find them, and they set their nets around them. So by deploying those to the east of Galapagos, the current drifts them through the marine reserve, and they can essentially take the fish of the marine reserve without even getting into the marine reserve. So there's all these threats that weren't as apparent back in the 90s and are very much more apparent now. So really, it's key. It became very obvious that it's key that we need to address these issues. Now, to your point as to this new marine reserve, the university that I work for, Universidad San Francisco de Quito, we were approached and asked to build or to compile all the scientific information that will help guide a decision-making process. So we spent 2 years developing this blueprint for spatial management of the entire EEZ around Galapagos. And I led that with Susana Cardenas, another professor here at the university, and researchers not just from our university, but nationally and from across the globe. And we built a series of scenarios that responded to all those objectives, from the fish aggregation devices to the climate change to the migratory routes. What's ended up happening is that when the president declared this new marine reserve, he was quite clear, if you read the declaration, that its primary objective is to protect those migratory routes. So they're focusing on this issue right now. So this marine reserve won't address drifting fish aggregation devices. That's not what it's meant to do. It's addressed specifically to help protect those species that migrate by providing them with a safe haven as they migrate, not just at either end of their migratory routes.
And yeah, and so you kind of referenced it earlier, but the space between the Galapagos Islands and the Galapagos Marine Reserve and the Costa Rican Cocos National Park and the surrounding marine protected area as well, there is that ridge line of underwater terrain, I guess that you could call it, and the significance of that terrain is that is a place that, or those landforms are used by migrating species such as hammerhead sharks to move safely between these two areas of high biodiversity, a very productive habitat, correct?
That's correct, yes. And in fact, that leads to a very important point. Ecuador has created a no-take corridor that runs from Galapagos right up until the border. Costa Rica has expanded Isla del Coco, which is fantastic, but what they've done in addition to that, they've created something called the Bicentennial Management Zone that extends down to the border of Ecuador. Now, we really need to ensure that management zone contemplates a no-take corridor that picks up where Ecuador drops off and goes all the way to Cocos. Otherwise, we do run the risk of losing any benefits that we get from a biodiversity perspective, thanks to the actions of Ecuador once we hit the border with Costa Rica. So it will be really important over the coming months to watch how Costa Rica develop this management plan. And we're watching that with interest and of course, offering all the tracks of all the animals that we've tagged from the Ecuadorian side to the process in Costa Rica so that they can see how these animals move. And we really hope that they follow through with this commitment for Panama and Colombia made in December in Glasgow to, encourage the creation of these protected corridors. So we'll see. The jury's out on that one, but we'll see how it goes.
It's certainly an interesting collision between the field of conservation, the field of marine management, and politics, transnational relations, things like that. So it is definitely, from that sense, very interesting to keep an eye on moving forward. Now, in order to capitalize on this historic moment for marine conservation that you've outlined so eloquently for us, a lot of organizations, including Galapagos Conservancy, have invested and reinvested in marine conservation efforts. And so Galapagos Conservancy, we here at Galapagos Conservancy have decided to invest our support in the Galapagos Whale Shark Project, which is another organization that you are very intimately familiar with, along with your contemporary Jonathan Green. Could you tell us a little bit about the Galapagos Whale Shark Project?
Sure. I mean, and again, it's one of those other organizations that started off as a concept and as a conversation. So Jonathan has been in Galapagos since long before I have, and we first started talking about whale sharks back in 2005, I think. And it's quite funny because I worked for an NGO in Galapagos at the time, and we approached my boss and said, look, Jonathan's a guide and a biologist, and we've been talking about tagging some whale sharks and understanding their movements. And my boss said to us, fantastic, but no. I said, well, why not? And she said, well, the thing is, there's only a handful of whale sharks up at Darwin, so you'd never get a large enough sample size. So anything that you do would be, scientifically, questionable because of your sample size. And that was it. And it wasn't until years later where I no longer had to ask permission. And Jonathan had done a lot of work in really building the idea of the project and trying to find funding that we were able to execute this. And so we started work in 2011, and we found that my old boss from years ago was partially right. So there are only a handful of whale sharks up at Darwin at any given time. But the idea that people had was that, there were these 4 or 5 whale sharks hanging around Darwin between July and November was absolutely untrue. There were 4 or 5 at any given time, but their residency at Darwin was about a day and a half. So suddenly we had this complete change in paradigm. We no longer had a small resident population. We had a steady stream of probably around 700 or more whale sharks passing through Darwin throughout the season. Not only that, but then they passed through again on their way back. And what we found was that it was mostly females, very, very large, twice the size of the average size of whale sharks in any of the other aggregations that had been studied anywhere else in the world at that time. And what we found was that they were heading out into the Pacific, and they seemed to hang around an area called no oceanic front. So where 2 currents slide past each other, you have these tropical instability waves that kind of propagate down. And they seem to hang out in there, or they track them. In fact, we actually got so much detail of their movements. They were inside the tropical instability waves, tracking down. And then they'd circle back after about 1,000 miles away from Galapagos for about a month and a half. And then they'd circle back and come through Darwin again. And then by the end of the year, they'd be off the coast of Peru and Ecuador. And then the tags would pop off, and we had all sorts of things. So originally the idea was, well, these are big females with distended abdomens, they must be pregnant. And so after that, the question became, well, how would we be able to tell that? And a lot of these conversations, I have to be honest, they went, over a glass of beer or a whiskey in the evenings and crazy ideas. I remember us talking once about, wouldn't it be amazing if we could do an underwater ultrasound? And we fell about laughing. Just imagine, in a 3-knot current at 60 feet depth, trying to do an ultrasound on a free swimming 12-meter whale shark. Not a hope in hell. until we got in touch with Rui and Kiyomi at the Okinawa Aquarium. And they have an ultrasound equipment and they have experience in doing ultrasounds and taking blood because they have whale sharks in their aquarium. And so we invited them over to Galapagos, and they've now come 2 or 3 times, I think, and we've done these ultrasounds. What's really funny is that I was saying that 99% of these whale sharks are females. In fact, until recently, I'd only ever seen one male. And so I was on that first trip, I was preparing Rui and saying, look, just the first shark you can get, just go for it, because it'll be a female. And we went down and we found this big, well, not such a big whale shark, but it was very clearly a male. It had big claspers. And he looked at me and I just do the ultrasound anyway. And I'd just like to report here officially that whale shark was not pregnant. But what's more interesting is that we've not found any indication of pregnancy on any of the others either. So it's a little bit of a case now back to the drawing board. Now, I must also add that when we've done these trips, it's been towards the back end of the season. So this is when the sharks are on the way back from that loop that they do out in the Pacific towards the coast. So they're not pregnant then. There is a chance that they may be pregnant on the way out. So our next aim is to carry out the same studies, but early on in the season, kind of June, July, and maybe even earlier if we can catch them before they arrive at Darwin. But there the big question is, well, where are they before they arrive in Darwin? You know, we kind of lose track of them in January off the coast of Ecuador, and then they appear in Darwin in July. So where are they in between? And I'm actually going next week to see if we can find them, because we start getting reports of whale sharks in the southern islands around February, March. So it's very much exploration. But you know, these sharks, they do go to Cocos. We've had 2 now that have gone up to Cocos. One actually inside the previous park boundaries, which is only 12 nautical miles, so right in there. And another one that went to the border of the park and then ended up in Malpelo National Park. So they are very good indicators of connectivity. And unfortunately, they are vulnerable to some fishing practices. In fact, this year, the team tagged 8 whale sharks back in September. 3 of those tags have appeared in fishing ports. Now, that is a significant proportion of the number of tags. And I don't think those sharks were caught necessarily and landed, but they were entangled. And so that does create issues. Any of these interactions between humans and whale sharks are cause for concern.
And you did a really, I think, kind of good job of referencing it there. But one of the things that I found really interesting when preparing for this talk was how little, up until very recently, was known about whale sharks in general. They seem to be one of the ocean's true mysteries, and I wonder if you can kind of expand on just why these massive, massive fish, I mean, the world's largest fish, why we seem to know so little about them.
Well, I think we know a lot more than we used to know. I think part of that is still a bit of inertia on the fact that it's the biggest mystery. It's not the biggest mystery, but it still has mysteries and secrets that have not been resolved. And one of them is precisely its reproductive biology. And why is that? Well, for many years, whale shark research was limited to studying them when they aggregate. Whale sharks are solitary ocean wanderers, but they do aggregate at coastal locations for feeding at particular times of year to take advantage of reef spawning events. But at those aggregations, there are 70% males or more, and mostly immature. So even the early tagging work was very much focused on immature males. So it really wasn't until, in Galapagos, where we have just a completely different demographic, that we started to look at the more oceanic sites. And now there's people working in St. Helena where you get adult male and females, and there are reports even of mating. So we're starting to break open some of those secrets. But a lot of what we know from the reproductive biology dates back to a single female who was caught in Taiwan, I think it was 1996. And she had, I think it was 304 embryos inside her. And what's interesting about her is that those 304 embryos were all from the same father, or at least they took a random sample and tested them genetic, and all the samples were from the same father. So probably a single father, and yet they were all at different stages of development. So of that female, the female was dead, but some of those embryos were so close to being born that they were kept in pools for months. Others were still in their egg cases. Now that strikes me as very interesting, because one of the holy grails of whale shark research is, well, where do they go to pup? Where are their pupping grounds? Where are their nursery grounds? Well, maybe they don't have any, because if you wonder, or and you're carrying 300 pups, all at different stages of development, is there a single ground that you're just going to hang out and wait until everything's ready to go? Or are you going to pop them out bit by bit out in the open ocean? And that's where potentially this, this loop potentially could be a pupping ground. It's an area where you get concentration of plankton, so there would be food there. There have been maybe 24 neonate whale sharks found globally. They're very, very rare. When they have, it tends to be close to very deep water, or in the stomach of a sailfish, in the stomach of a blue shark, so open ocean species. So there is an argument that maybe this is a pupping route, but I don't even want to get there yet without knowing that they're pregnant in the first place. So the other argument is that this is a feeding ground, and because they're large females, they have different dietary requirements from smaller animals. So, and I think the nice thing about our project, in the whale shark project, is that we don't all have the same opinion. So it keeps us on our toes. I think that the best science is done when we have competing hypotheses and we want to go out and test them. And so there's no dogma about it. It's okay, so is it this? What would we need to know in order for it to be this? And that's really helped us develop this project. It's a really exciting project. I hope they're pregnant, but I don't think they are. But I hope they are. So I'm leaning now more towards the feeding hypothesis. But at some point, they've got to be pregnant, right? So maybe again, it's not a specific pupping migration, but this is their movement between feeding grounds, and at any given point, a certain proportion of them are pregnant and are pupping. So it could be a mixture of both, and then everyone's right.
Well,
and wrong at the same time.
Yeah, of course. That's science, right?
Yeah.
And I know that I think that I can speak for all of us here at Galapagos Conservancy that we're all very excited to see the results and the ongoing data acquisition from the Galapagos Whale Shark Project. I think that it is so fascinating what the kind of science and the kind of questions that you're answering, because as you said, it's almost those most fundamental questions, the life histories, the breeding, how do these animals reproduce, where do they come from, really, that I think that the Galapagos Whale Shark Project is answering. And so I think it's going to be really, really exciting to see what you all are able to learn hopefully in the near future.
The other thing is, of course, that whale sharks, for some reason, have gathered the most amazing community of researchers across the globe. I think it's the only shark, I may be wrong, maybe the white sharks have a similar, but we have a global conference every 3 years just for whale sharks. And the nice thing is that we can call upon each other to give each other a hand in any particular issue. So, the folks at Okinawa Aquarium are fantastic. I'm actually going out on Monday with the folks from the Georgia Aquarium. They've been with us several times. We have colleagues working off Mozambique with the Marine Megafauna Foundation. So it's really amazing that we can rely on each other for interchange of data, in a sense like a whale shark focused version of Migmar on a global scale. And but I mean, I don't say this gratuitously, because it is important, that interchange of knowledge and experience in handling the animals and dealing with different sizes and different conditions it's key to breaking open those secrets of these animals that have such a wide distribution.
And as it is with Migmar, as it is with this global coalition of whale shark scientists and experts and researchers, science in general, and especially when it comes to conservation, is absolutely a group effort. It is a community effort to learn and exchange information, because at the end of the day, we're all working in conjunction to try to solve these grand questions and these grand issues that are facing our natural world. And that brings me to my next question. Our next point in this discussion is that now we are, again, tapping into your wealth of knowledge to help us collaboratively launch this citizen science effort that you have been working on for a while. So I was wondering if you could tell our viewers at home a little bit about the Shark Count app.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. This is a great project, and it's a way that anyone can help. All they have to do is get out and get into the water. No, it's this was again a confluence of ideas. So I'd been at Isla del Coco in the early 2000s, and I was really impressed how at that time there was a single company, a tour company working there, the Undersea Hunter Group, and they just had it so figured out. They knew that their business model depended on the health of the Cocos marine environment. So they've always been strong supporters of conservation in Cocos, and they've helped the national park. But what they also did is that their guides, their dive guides, after every dive, they had to record what they'd seen, a very simple spreadsheet. I dived at this location for this amount of time, and then you've got a list of species, and you just check how many of each you saw. I saw 1 tiger shark, 3 hammerheads, and a green turtle, whatever. But that data set ran from 1993 and is still running now. And I thought, well, why aren't we doing this in Galapagos? It's a no-brainer. We need to be able to say something about how the marine reserve is doing for these species. And so we got a little fund, and we tried to put together and this is before apps and smartphones and things. We put together a little survey form and asked guys to fill them in. And it didn't work. I think we asked for way too much information, and dive guys come home and they're tired, and to think about filling in a piece of paper and taking it somewhere and handing it in didn't happen. But then Galápagos Conservancy, in around 2012, I think it was, organized a workshop on citizen science, which I attended. And by then, apps and things were starting to become more commonly used. And so we created this partnership together with a private donor who was interested in apps and sharks. It was a marriage made in heaven. And we developed this Shark Count Galapagos, which essentially is, you create your account, you go diving, and then after your dive, you literally plot in your dive site from a pull-down menu, and then you've got species, and you say how many you saw, how long was your dive, and Bob's your uncle. But it also gives you instant feedback, because you can then ask the app, what's the best month to see X species at X site, and you get the annual monthly averages, or what am I going to see at this site, and you can see per dive I'll see half a hammerhead and 3 sunfish or something. So it gives information to someone who's planning on diving Galapagos and wants to know where to go. It's a really good tool for dive guides, because if they know, they can check on the recent dives and say, at León Dormido for the last couple of weeks, we've not seen any sharks. So they can start in their briefing talking to the tourists about the nudibranchs and about the octopus and about, pumping up some of the other species. Or, hey, we have sunfish here at the moment, so let's talk about sunfish. And that allows you to engage and talk with your tourists more. And enriches the experience. And it also allows us to help management, because there are certain sites that we could maybe expand, contract, certain times of year, that kind of thing. And then of course, from a scientific perspective, we're interested in the long term. And what happened at Cocos was that a paper was published that showed that Cocos Island, tiger sharks appeared out of nowhere, and suddenly your probability of seeing a tiger shark at certain sites was 1. You're almost guaranteed, whereas green turtle populations almost disappeared at the same time. They've got something going on there, some interaction. Hammerhead shark abundance dropped by 45%, despite the fact that there's a marine reserve. Well, it's a very small marine reserve. Luckily, now they've just expanded it, but the sharks forage offshore at night. That's when they're going to be vulnerable to longlining. So it allows you to evaluate how your marine reserve is doing. And I think one of the big concerns in Galapagos is that after 25 years, near enough, we still can't really say how the marine reserve is doing. And that is a worry. And I just want to bring it full circle. So actually, the Undersea Hunter Group, who work at Cocos, came to Galapagos in 2019 with Dr. Sylvia Earle. We did a research trip together. And while we were on the boat, I presented the shark counts. I said, well, it would be nice if everyone could use it, download it while we have internet. And then once we're out of internet, out of cell phone range, you can still use it. It will just queue your results. And the guys from the boat were just listening in afterwards. They said, this is amazing. We want this for Cocos. And I said to them, no, the whole point of this is inspired by you. You've got an amazing 30-year data set. And they said, no, let's merge it and use this as a tool. So I felt like we'd come full circle because we've literally just launched Shark Count Cocos, Shark Count Mexican Pacific, Shark Count mainland Ecuador, and the new Shark Count Galapagos, which has new species and the snorkel mode too. And so it's come full circle, but really this was born from the industry, from the dive industry. So, and the idea is, just to go back to how you can help, anyone who's diving or snorkeling in any of those sites, use it. It's dead easy to use, it's fun to use. You can upload photos as well, and you're providing anyone at any of those sites with valuable information to be able to track how our marine heritage is doing.
Yeah, I just think that, obviously, as you've spoken to, the value of being able to collect data at a large scale, utilizing people who are already there to see the wildlife in the first place, it just makes so much sense. And additionally, it gives people, such an opportunity to be able to really involve themselves in conservation immediately, in the conservation management aspect of the islands and the waters surrounding them. I just think it's such a cool opportunity. So again, could you tell us how people could get involved in that?
Absolutely. It has its own webpage, so you can go to sharkcount.org, or you can check it out on your where do you buy apps? The Android, the Google Play, and I'm sorry, I'm still not up to date with that, but with iTunes, right, at the app stores, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so it's free to download, free to install. You will need an internet account when you install it because you have to set up your account. They send you an email with a verification code. But once you've got it installed, then you're good to go. So what I tend to do, come up after dive, get changed, have a hot chocolate, and put in my data before I forget. It's very easy to forget. If you're out on a cruise and you're diving 3 times a day, you've forgotten what dive you saw what. So this is really a nice and easy way to keep yourself up to date. And then, of course, you've got a record of what you saw as well.
Yeah. So, you heard it here first, folks. If you're planning a trip down to Galapagos soon, go onto the App Store, go onto the Android store, download this app, because not only is it a cool way to involve yourself in conservation, not only is it a very cool way to keep track of the different species of marine wildlife that you saw during your time visiting Galapagos, but it also helps out guys like Dr. Alex Hearn who desperately need that data to continue to protect and restore these marine ecosystems in and around the Galapagos archipelago. Now, the final question before we take questions from the audience. So again, if you all have questions or comments for Dr. Hearn, please feel free to put those in the comments, and we will address some of those if we have time. The big question, I guess, is what is the current condition of migratory species in the Pacific? And do you feel like we are headed in a positive direction moving forward?
Well, like I said, we looked at these 30 species across a range of, sharks and seabirds and turtles. And overall, the situation isn't good. They're declining. And the hammerhead is the classic example there. I do, however, think it's almost like a race in a sense of downhill, and can we stop this and reverse the trend? Ecuador, at least, I think, has taken some fairly significant steps quite recently. So only in June 2020, the government banned the sale and landing of all oceanic whitetips, which are in a deplorable condition. Some might say it's closing the barn door after the horse has bolted, but at least it's now done. But also all the hammerhead species. So we have the smooth and scalloped hammerhead, then very sporadic sightings of great hammerheads and also bonnet heads. So all those species are now absolutely protected by Ecuadorian law in all Ecuadorian waters. Then, of course, we had in December the announcement that we would of the new marine reserve, and another marine reserve as well, which perhaps didn't get as much recognition, but I do want to take a moment to talk about it. This is a grassroots-led marine reserve on the coast of Ecuador in a remote community that you can only get there either by boat or half-hour truck drive on a dirt track in Puerto Caboyal in northern Manabí. And that area there is a nursery ground for hammerhead sharks, but also for other species too. And so colleagues of mine in Migramar have been working with the community there for a few years, and they're a fishing community, and they're concerned that industrial fishermen don't respect the 8-mile limit and are depleting their resources. And so they went to the Ministry of Environment and said, we want a marine reserve. We want a marine reserve because it will allow the government to make much stricter penalties for any industrial fishermen come in. We release any sharks that we catch. Can we do something? And so almost the same time that the Galapagos Declaration happened, the Puerto Caboyal Declaration happened too. And I know the Galapagos kind of took the world stage, but this was a key moment because this is a poor, remote fishing community standing up and saying, we want a marine reserve here to protect our sharks and our livelihoods. And that's the way forward. So, and again, what I'm hoping is that community can then capitalize on that and receive, low-level tourism or students and really see some economic benefits beyond the fact that their fishing resources will be enhanced. So that's exciting. Lots of things happening. We just have to hope that they can happen and be implemented fast enough and solidly enough to prevent these declines.
And what was the name of that marine reserve again, of that community, just so that we can give them adequate credit here on the program?
Yes, the community is called Puerto Caboyal.
Okay.
In the north of the Manabí area, about 3-hour drive north of Manta.
Gotcha. Well, congratulations and thank you to them for the grassroots effort that led to that. I think that's incredible. Thank you so much for bringing that to our attention. Now, we do have some questions from the audience. Let me go see what we have so far. This is an interesting one. I'd be interested to see, because this is a little more complex of an issue. So this is from Leslie. As thrilling as it is to have the legal expansion of the Galapagos Marine Reserve, what plans are in the works to provide resources to patrol the area and enforce what is on paper? So I know that for us, I can only speak for Galapagos Conservancy specifically. We have for a long time partnered directly with the Galapagos National Park Directorate to provide the resources necessary to allow them to do regular patrols of the marine reserve area to keep an eye out for illegal fishing activities and stuff. But I'm curious if you were able to expand on that at all.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And, we've seen all too often the issue of paper parks being created, and then they just sit there and nothing happens. So a park has to come with a budget and with the tools to be able to implement it. Now, this one starts off at a certain advantage in that it's going to be managed by the Galapagos National Park, who already have a fair infrastructure in place alongside the Navy with ocean-going vessels. So the infrastructure is partially there. I think they would need more staff, improved capability. There's also economies of scale in terms of size, in terms of things like remote sensing. So we now often, all vessels in Galapagos have to have satellite tracking systems, and it's, you're not allowed to turn them off. That's already in fact, sorry, my Spanglish is getting bad as the afternoon wears on. What I understand, and again, I can't speak that much to it because my role has been more the role of the science, but I can only say what I've seen in the press and what I've heard from meetings is that Ecuador is discussing a debt swap agreement that would imply sustainable financing both for the control and monitoring of the new marine reserve and for improving sustainable livelihoods in Galapagos, as well as reducing the national debt. Now, if this comes through, and I don't know where the negotiations are, because that's an economist's field, so I don't know. But if that is pulled off, and I understand that that's the plan, then we'd have sustainable funding for this into the future. But she's absolutely right in her question. These things need to come with funding, otherwise it's just a paper park.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. As Leslie and you just said, the decree and the signing of the expansion of the Marine Reserve, both the promise to do so back in 2021 and then the official signing earlier this year in 2022, are massive landmark moments for the conservation of this part of the Galapagos Marine Reserve, but also the Eastern Pacific in general. But as you said, it's just the first step in a long, ongoing process to continue to protect the marine area, ecosystems, and resources in this region. We had another person have a question about whale sharks. Whale sharks seem to be very popular today. Let me see if I can pull that one up. So this one is from Cecil. This is an interesting question. Have you ever heard of the term whale pump?
No.
Okay. As it relates to climate change and whale sharks, I guess that probably doesn't necessarily reflect here, but you kind of already specified it, and in terms of sorry.
I mean, I just wonder, are they referring to perhaps carbon sequestration, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's what it was about. Yeah, do you know anything about that?
Well, no, except that, I mean, nothing that I've measured, but that I'm obviously aware that these species that move around in the ocean, these individuals that, especially ones that are large biomass, incorporating carbon into their bodies as they grow. If they die a natural death and sink down to the bottom of the ocean, then to a certain extent they are sequestering carbon, so they're doing their little bit for climate change. And I know that there are ongoing studies to try to measure the cost that fishing, the tuna industry, for example, means to that. So by removing those tuna and making them food for us, what are we losing in terms of their carbon sequestration role if they had been left to live out their lives and sink to the bottom of the sea? So yes, I it's not an area that I've looked at or that I'm particularly up to date on, but that's kind of the concept behind it. This carbon sequestration role, especially of whales, but also like whale sharks and other large megafauna. Absolutely.
Gotcha. That is so interesting. The more that you learn about how connected everything really is in this big biosphere we all share.
Fighting climate change.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think that is probably all the time we have for questions. But Dr. Hearn, how can people find you, your work, support you moving forward?
I think they can find me on social media. I mean, I have an Instagram account. I'm still not very good at it, but I'm doing my best. I tend to communicate a fair amount through Facebook, so I'm quite happy to accept any requests through there. You can share my email address with me. Another thing people can do is just, for me right now, there's a big threat in Galapagos that would undermine a lot of the damage that's been done, a lot of the gains with this new protected area. So, and I spoke a little bit about Costa Rica. So if anyone has contacts in Costa Rica or influence in Costa Rica, make yourselves heard. It's so important that we continue this migratory route. The other thing is I mentioned it obliquely, this idea of longlining that got me started in shark research all those years ago. It's never gone away. And the new marine reserve, Mandat Marine Reserve, is 30,000 square kilometers of Notake, and on either side, another total 30,000 square kilometers of no longlining outside the marine reserve. Unfortunately, inside the marine reserve, longlining does happen. At the moment, it happens illegally, but it's very hard to control. And some of the fish, especially swordfish, it gets landed, sent off to Miami, certified from Galapagos, and so in a sense, it's whitewashed swordfish in restaurants in Miami. And at the same time, there is still a strong push to allow longlining in Galapagos, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because we would then be the first marine reserve in the world that has a no longline zone outside and allows longlining inside. But this pressure is real, it exists. So, and it's even starting to gain support among NGOs. So I do want to make a call here to everyone who's listening who has any links with Galapagos, speak up, make yourselves heard. Long learning has no place in Galapagos. Doesn't matter how many cameras you have on the boat. This is not a fishing gear that's compatible with a marine reserve, especially given the difficulties in controlling such a gear in such a huge area. So anyone who can express themselves or offer their support on that would be much appreciated. And then, of course, come to Galapagos, dive, and use shark count.
Of course, absolutely. So yeah, as Alex mentioned, Dr. Hearn mentioned earlier, you can find him on Facebook, just Alex Hearn, Hearn. You can find him on Instagram at Galapagos Shark. And then additionally, I believe that his, do you want to put your email here and we can maybe put in the comments as well? What's your email, Dr. Hearn?
Yeah, ahearn@usfq.edu.ec.
There you go. And then if you would like to learn more about Migramar, you can go to migramar.org, migramar.org. And then, of course, the Galapagos Whale Shark project is at galapagoswhaleshark.org. So both organizations that are doing really, really critical work and that Galapagos Conservancy is partnering with in the future. Dr. Hearn, I just can't thank you enough for joining us today, for bringing your expertise and passion to the show. It's what speaking with and conversing with scientists, researchers, conservationists, passionate individuals like you that makes field transmissions what it is. So thank you so much for joining us. I know that all of us here at Galapagos Conservancy, we absolutely cannot wait to see what exciting new data and research and information comes out of this new Galapagos Shark project endeavor moving forward. But thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you viewing at home, thank you so much for tuning in. Again, if you are interested in helping to support our work, please visit galapagos.org to donate there to help us support projects like the Galapagos Whale Shark Project moving forward. And then, of course, as Dr. Hearn did mention as well, please definitely, if you are planning a trip to Galapagos anytime soon, go to the App Store, the Google Play Store, and download that Shark Count app for Galapagos as well. It certainly will help Dr. Hearn out. So Dr. Hearn, again, thank you so much for joining us today. Do you have any last messages for the crowd at home?
Just that if there's any budding marine biologists there, then we have our campus in San Cristobal. I actually teach a course there. I'll be teaching there next month, and we do have a study abroad program. So maybe I'll get to meet some of you at the GAIAS Research and the Galapagos Science Center over in San Cristobal at some point in the near future.
Well, there you go. The invite has been sent out. Dr. Hearn, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you all at home for tuning in to this episode. This has been Field Transmissions, and we will see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Un pequeño grupo de científicos y guardaparques ha iniciado un programa de monitoreo de tiburones desde el año 2006. La data recabada con esta información ha brindado datos de la abundancia relativa y estacionalidad de estas especies, pero principalmente de los tiburillos y el tiburón ballena.
But monitoring has been limited in scope to these two species and to the waters surrounding the islands of Darwin and Wolf, and data collection only occurs once or twice a year. To better understand and protect the Galapagos Marine Reserve, we need to capture larger numbers of observations from dive sites throughout the archipelago. With your help and Shark Count Galapagos, a free app for smartphones and tablets, we can do just that.
Shark Count Galapagos is a user-friendly tool that allows divers visiting the Galapagos Islands to help monitor marine life in the Galapagos Marine Reserve. With Shark Count, divers become citizen scientists and make important contributions to our understanding of Galapagos marine ecosystems by recording the number of sharks, sea turtles, rays, and ocean sunfish they encounter during their dives. Here's how it works. Step 1. Download the free Shark Count Galapagos app at the Apple Store or www.sharkcount.org. Step 2. Set up your account. You will be prompted to click on a link sent to your email to activate your account. Step 3. Once you have activated your account, return to the login option on Shark Count and enter your email address and password. You will be taken to the Shark Count homepage, where you will see options to review the identification guide, log a new dive, and to view data entered by others. By clicking on the menu icon at the top right of your screen, you will also be able to access instructions for using the app. Step 4. This is the fun part. During each dive, take notes on the number of each species observed and record other noteworthy observations, such as water temperature, water clarity, and any unexpected occurrences observed during the dive. Step 5. After each dive, enter your observations into Shark Count. After clicking on New Dive, you will be prompted to enter a dive site, date, dive company, numbers of each species observed, duration of your dive, and dive notes. Make sure to double-check your entries before submitting your observations. An internet connection is not necessary if you have already set up your account. If you don't have a connection, you will see a simplified homepage that will allow you to access the New Dive option. Your data will automatically update when internet connectivity is restored. Step 6. Add photos from each dive after you've submitted your observations by viewing your submissions under the Receives menu item. Step 7. You can view data entered by others on Shark Count by visiting the Counts option, where you can sort by species, dive site and time of year, or maps where you can refine your view by species.
With your help, Shark Count Galapagos can collect thousands of valuable observations that otherwise would not be available to scientists and managers in the marine reserve.
Esta información es fundamental para poder entender el estado de los ecosistemas, pero principalmente de los tiburones. De esta manera podemos aplicar políticas de manejo para su conservación. Te agradecemos desde ya formar parte de la ciencia ciudadana, brindando un poco de tu tiempo para Shark Count.